Hello my dear students, hope all of you are great and fine. Let's resume our novel A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Today we're going to talk about a new chapter and a lot of exciting events. The chapter is entitled The Marquis. As we all know, who is the Marquis? The Marquis simply is the uncle of Charles Darnay. As I said before, you may call him Charles Darnay or Charles Darnay. The two are correct. Okay. Let's talk about the setting. The setting, it's 1780, some days later. And it's all, by the way, in France. The first place we're going to go to Saint Antoine Street, okay? The second, we're going to go to a village, and that village was near the chateau. Here's, if you take a look, here's the chateau palace, okay, of the Marquis. And the last one, it is the chateau of the Marquis himself, okay? We discussed before the symbolism of the broken cask of wine, as well as the symbolism of the echoing footsteps in chapter 5. In chapter 6, we have the last symbolism, which is the Marquis himself. Who is the Marquis? What does he stand for? Okay, let's read. The Marquis is the symbol of the whole French aristocracy. As we all know, the French aristocrats, they are a lot, by the way. They are a lot of families. Okay, so Charles Dickens, our novelist or our writer, okay, of the novel, okay, he just take one example for the whole French aristocrats, who is the Marquis, to show how people at that time of the royal family or of high rank were extremely cruel, vicious. They have no heart. So also the Marquis, he is the symbol of the injustice, like no fairness at all, and the tyranny, oppression, cruelty, okay, of the aristocrats, and also the aristocrats' lack of concern. Lack of concern, like they don't care about the poor class. And as we all know, we call the poor class the mob. If you just ask you to describe the Marquis using some traits or some adjectives, you will tell me that the Marquis was heartless. Someone doesn't have a heart at all. Usually when we add less in a word, it means without. And also he was somehow ruthless, it means also heartless. He was cold-hearted, okay, like have no feelings, and merciless, like completely have no mercy. He was leading. Leading means living, okay? Living what? A luxurious life, a high standard life, okay? And he just felt nothing of the miserable condition of the mob. If I describe the Marquis more, I would say that he was somehow brutal, he was vicious, okay, hideous person. He exploit like he made use, okay, of the peasants, and I mean by the peasant, the poor class or the villagers. That's all the Marquis. Of course, you can add more and more adjectives describing the Marquis' cruel character. Yep. We're going to have new characters, and they are simply two, and please, I ask you to memorize the names of the characters quite well. One is a character name and one is like a profession or a job. We don't know his real identity. The first one is Gabelle. And who is Gabelle? Gabelle simply is, he is the servant of the Marquis, as well as he is the tax collector. What's a tax collector? Someone who was in charge of collecting the taxes. Do I mean by that Gabelle was a kind of a vicious person, cruel person? No. He was one of the poor class, by the way, but he was working for the Marquis. So he received orders or instructions from the Marquis, and he had to carry out all the instructions. Even if he wasn't convinced of this, he had to do that because it is part of his job. And because maybe if he say no or disagree or objects, okay, he might be killed by the Marquis. And also you're going to see Gaspard, he's going to appear one more time. You're going to see him in chapter 6. And a road mender or a road repairer. A road repairer, it's not his own name, it's his own work. He's a man who simply fixes or mend the broken roads. So we call him a road mender or a road repairer. The main incidents for that kind of a chapter, we're going to have that the Gaspard's son, as we all know, would die. You're going to know. And we're going to experience or encounter the cruelty of the Marquis and his cruel reactions toward the poor boy who had been crushed under the wheels of his carriage. And you're going to see the road mender, okay, he would see, or the road repairer, he would see Gaspard clinging by the chains of the Marquis carriage because he wants to take revenge for his son. You can also see kind of a dialogue form between the Marquis as well as Charles Darnay. And the last main incident here, that they're going to discover that the Marquis would be killed at the end of the chapter. Let's start each and every point in more detail. As we know that Saint Antoine Street was a kind of a narrow street, a narrow one, okay? And people who live in Saint Antoine were completely poor, as we all know. So one day the Marquis was in his own carriage, and inside the carriage I have the Marquis, I have Gabelle the servant, and I also have a carriage driver. A narrow passage or a narrow street, it means that you shouldn't go on using excess speed. But the Marquis, because he lacked concern for the poor class, what did he do? His own carriage was dashing. I mean by dashing was speeding, going with a kind of excess speed in Saint Antoine Street. People who live in Saint Antoine, they were almost screaming, to the extent that women were clutching, taking away their sons away from the carriage, in fear they might be crushed under the carriage wheel. Until by accident or by chance, a little boy, okay, and that boy would be Gaspert's son. The boy was crushed. He had no time to avoid the carriage, so he was crushed, okay, under the Marquis carriage, and he died at once. It was common at that time that usually the royal carriages, they may crush anyone under its wheels and complete their way, never to go back and look at their wounded people ever. Okay, but for some reason, the horses, you know, you call the word rear. Rear, like when the two legs of the horse gonna go up and then down one more time. So the horses stop. As a result, the carriage, it has to stop as well. People, they did not ever dare to look at the Marquis in his own eyes, ever. They were simply looking down in a very submissive way, and somehow of, let's say, degradation or humiliation. Okay, the Marquis was looking at all of them as if were simply rats coming out of their holes, animals, okay, slaves for him. He doesn't care about the old people ever. Let's see the Gaspard reaction. The distraught father, and I mean by distraught, the poor father, what did he do? He carried the dead body of his son, and he just settled the dead body on, like, over the fountain, the edge of a fountain, because in Saint Antoine we have a fountain, and he kept wailing, weeping, crying for his son's death, okay, howling like a kind of a wild animal. And he said, killed, like you killed my son. Okay, his voice sounded all over Saint Antoine Street. One of the people who was completely like a poor person, I mean, dressed in rag, and I mean by rag when you dressed in a kind of a t-shirt, whatever, full of holes because you are so poor. The Marquis was still in his own carriage. He asked that man, what's going on? Why is that man, he refers to Gaspard, I mean, why he was howling? What's wrong? He said, Monsieur the Marquis, it's a pity. The little boy who had been crushed was his own son. Okay, what did the Marquis do you expect him to do? Will he say sorry, apologize, express his apology? No, of course, ever. So Gaspard, because he was completely sad, what did he do, Gaspard? He started to run towards the Marquis carriage. He wants to attack the Marquis for killing his son to take revenge. When the Marquis saw him approaching him, coming near to him, he put his own hands on his sword. It was like a sort of a warning to Gaspard that if you come near, I will kill you, okay? So Gaspard just stood in his place and he kept crying one more time, saying, killed, killed. And that part, the Marquis, he just opened, like, say, window or of his carriage, and he started talking to the poor class. What did he say? He blamed the poor class for being careless, reckless. They don't take care of their own selves or their own children. I mean that he blamed the poor class for being careless. Was that the fault of the poor class? Of course no. It was his own fault because his own carriage was dashing, moving with high speed in a very narrow street like Saint Antoine. As a sort of compensation, what did he do, the Marquis, which is so provocative, by the way? He opened his purse and he just tossed, he just threw a gold coin to Gaspard. Like, take it as a sort of a compensation for killing your son. Can you imagine his own cruelty and his own lack of heart? He has no heart at all. That sort of action, it provoked Gaspard more and more. So he started running for the second time, wanted to attack the Marquis carriage. So how many times we have that kind of attack? 2 times. He tried to attack the Marquis carriage for twice, I mean. In the second time when he was running toward the Marquis, carriage, who appeared or who showed up? Monsieur Defarge, because we are in Saint-Antoine. As we all know that Monsieur Defarge was the leader of the Jacks, which means that he was also the leader of who? Of Gaspard. When Gaspard saw Monsieur Defarge, he just froze in his place saying, killed, like he killed my son, okay? And he kept crying, weeping, putting his own head on the shoulder of Monsieur Defarge. Monsieur Defarge tried to comfort him. So what did he tell him? He told him that it was much more better for that little child, okay, that to die, than to grow up and live in misery, oppression, cruelty, paying taxes, poverty. When Monsieur Defarge was talking in a loud voice, who heard him quite well? The Marquis. So the Marquis, he said, hey, you over there, what's your name? He said, my name is Ernest Defarge. What's your trade? He said, I'm a wine seller. Okay, I liked what you said. You are a philosopher. You are a wise man. And as a sort like a benefit for Monsieur Defarge, the Marquis, he opened his purse one more time and he tossed another gold coin to Monsieur Defarge. So how many coins we have? Simply there are 2 coins. One for Gaspard and one for Monsieur Defarge. What's so comic here? That the poor class in Saint-Antoine, they kept looking at the coin until the coin simply landed on the floor of Saint-Antoine, as if each one of them would have the intention to pick up the coin. Simply why? Because they are so poor. Okay, poverty, one more time, is poverty. Take a look at the photo. Here is the Marquis in his in his carriage, and here is the carriage, okay, when the little child was crushed under it. Can you imagine? Okay. After a while, the Marquis was simply so, he cares only for the safety of his horses. That's all he cared about, the safety of his horses. Okay. Before leaving, he gave orders for the carriage to go on. Let me tell you that the Marquis was on his way to his chateau. To reach his chateau, he had to go by Saint-Antoine, and the second destination will be a poor village, and that poor village is very near to Saint-Antoine. And then we have the chateau of the Marquis. It's just like one map or one way, one route. Okay, so he gave order to the carriage to move on, to complete its way. When the carriage started just moving a little bit, just kind of let's say miles, whatever, unknown hand, unknown like we don't know who. That unknown hand, what did it do? It just picked up the coin from the floor of ground of Saint-Antoine and just threw back the coin at the Marquis carriage, like, take back your money, we don't want your money, we don't need compensation. So that sort of action provoked the Marquis so much, so he asked to hold the horses and stop the carriage. The Marquis turned around, looking at the people in Saint-Antoine. He saw that Gaspard was still wailing and crying for his son, and he saw that all people were like slaves looking down. No one dared to look at the Marquis in his own eyes except Madame Defarge. Madame Defarge, she was so kind of a challenging lady. She was so strong. She was never afraid of the Marquis. She stood looking at the Marquis like giving him a challenge, looking in his own eyes, sort of a fearful look. And she was knitting, as we know, as usual. The Marquis starting rebuke or scolded the poor class, calling them all that they are dogs. He said, hey dogs, who did it? Who just threw back the coin? If I knew who did it, the identity of this person, I would crush him under the wheels of the carriage. I would exterminate him. And he didn't have any answer. After a while, he gave order, okay, for the carriage to move on. The second destination was a kind of a poor village, and that poor village was very near to Saint-Antoine. If we imagine that we are in the village it has like a kind of a hill like a small mountain. Okay, so down the hill was a kind of a road repairer, a man who was just working. His main work or job was to fix the road. The man was working hard, okay, and the carriage of the Marquis passed by the hill. As we know that a hill, you have to go up the hill and then go one more time. When the carriage started moving from Saint Antoine, Gaspard, he decided to take revenge for his son. So what did he do? He hid the pass of hide. He hid himself under the Marquis carriage, and he kept like clinging, hold tightly the chains, okay, that's down or under the carriage of the Marquis. And if even we're going to assume that people in Saint Antoine saw Gaspard hiding himself under the Marquis carriage, no one will snitch on him, because simply all of them were against the cruelty of the Marquis. All of them wanted him to take revenge for killing his little son. So the carriage started going up, if you just imagine or visualize it, start to go up the hill. Who's under the carriage? Simply Gaspard, okay? The road repairer was so astonished because he saw a man that he had never seen before hiding himself, or have the bravery to hide himself under the Marquis carriage. The Marquis kept going up until it reached the summit of the hill, and then it stopped. It stopped in a place we call it a posting house. A posting house is like a stable in which we have to exchange the horses. At that time, it was a long destination, for horses could never hold, okay, or bear to go on moving high kind of destination, long destination. So they have to stop in the middle of any journey and exchange, like swap the horses, take out the old horses, the tired horses, and give new horses. So during this time of the exchange of the horses, the Marquis was outside the carriage, as well as Gabad the servant, and the coach driver was just monitoring, okay, the exchange of the horses. People in that poor village was extremely poor. Simply poor, why? Because they had to pay a lot of taxes. To who? To the upper class, including the Marquis. So in the village we have just one poor fountain, one poor church, and so on. People had to eat onions for supper, cut onions and eat onion for supper. No food, starvation, hunger. And sometimes they just cut the grass as well as the leaves of the tree, wash them all in the fountain and eat it. Could you imagine the poverty of the poor class at that time? Okay. People who in the poor village, they kept looking at the Marquis in fear. The Marquis noticed who? The road repairer. He asked him, come on, bring me that tricycle. When the road repairer stood in front of the Marquis, he said, yes, Monsieur the Marquis. He said that I passed by you by my carriage. How dare you? How dare you look at my carriage? I saw you from the window of the carriage looking at my carriage. If you remember in chapter 1, I said that you can never look at any carriage that belongs to one of the upper class. And if you dare and look at it or didn't stop and bow, they're going to cut your hands, remember, burn you alive, and so on. So he's telling him, how could you do this? The man, because he was too innocent, he said, Monsieur the Marquis, I wasn't looking at you. I was looking at the man who was hiding himself under your carriage. When he said these words, okay, Gabad the servant, he just went down checking the carriage. He said, no one is under the carriage. Why? Because when the carriage stopped, we can imagine or conclude that Gaspard vanished, hid himself away. He said, no one's under the carriage. The man kept swearing, saying, Monsieur the Marquis, I swear I saw a man, and that man was hiding himself under your carriage. When the Marquis asked him to give his name, reveal his identity, the man said, I don't know him. It's my first time to see him. By the way, the man wasn't lying. You know why? Because that man, road repairer, he was from the poor village. And Gaspard, he was from Saint Antoine. So he had never seen him before. But the idea that the road repairer gave full description of Gaspard, and that part will be important in chapter 8. He said that he was tall as a ghost, he was white as a whatever, so he gave him full description, okay? And then Gabad released, set free, the road repairer, after the Marquis, as we all know, kept swearing and calling bad names for him. Okay, it was time for the Marquis to enter or step inside his carriage one more time, going back home to his chateau. When they reached the chateau of the Marquis, the chateau, it has a kind of a gates in front of the chateau, and the gates was guarded by guards, officers. On this day, the Marquis was expecting his nephew Charles Darnley to come from England to see him in France. Okay, so he asked the Marquis, he asked the guards, had my nephew arrived? Nephew, Charles Darnley. They said, not yet, sir. He said, okay, once he arrived, notify me, tell me. Okay, and we can also assume that once the carriage started moving one more time from the poor village, Gaspard one more time hid himself under the carriage. Okay, So the gates were widely open and the Marquis carriage entered, okay? The chateau was surrounded by a kind of a large garden. In the garden we have a lot of decoration in form of statues. The statues were all made of stone, simply like the Marquis heart. He has a stone heart. Statues in form of urns, statues in form of flowers, statues in form of lion, faces of men, and so on. The Marquis entered his own chateau, and if you compare the chateau, the luxury of the chateau of the Marquis to the poor village, we can see as the gap between the aristocrats and the poor class. He entered his chateau and he went to his dining room. Dining room, kind of a large room. It has a long table surrounded by a lot of chairs. And the Marquis was just on the top, at the head, I mean, like the headquarter of the table itself, having his own meal and just sipping his wine. While he was sitting in his own chair, his chair was opposite to a window, and that window, it overlooks the garden of the chateau. So he was about to just sip, like drink, I mean the wine, and he recognized, or he saw a kind of a dark shadow running in his garden. We can visualize or conclude that that was Gaspard, was trying to hide himself in the Marquis' bedroom to take revenge for killing his son. The Marquis asked the servant, what's that? What's going on? Who is over there? The servant or the gabelle, he just opened the blind, like a curtains. He checked and he said to the Marquis, no one was outside except the tree and the garden. After a while, who arrived? He was simply Charles Darnley, the nephew of the Marquis. And it was a cold welcome. You can never imagine that whenever you see your uncle, you can keep on shaking hands. Hi, my uncle, how are you? No. The Marquis and Charles Darnley, it was a cold kind of meeting. No hello, no greeting words, no even shaking hands. So when Darnley arrived, the servant, the gabelle, he just brought a plate meal, okay, like a kind of a plate full of food for Charles Darnley, as well as a glass of wine. When he was inside the dining room, okay, not word was spoken or was exchanged between the Marquis and Charles Darnley. When that person left, I mean the servant, they start talking. Let me summarize, okay, the conversation or the dialogue between the Marquis and his uncle. Charles Darnley visited his uncle, as you see here, the Marquis. They talked about the life Darnley was living or leading in England, and as we all know that he worked as a French teacher. The Marquis was angry, furious, hot under the collar, and he disapproved, like he was against what? The whole situation. Why? Because Darnley would be his follower, his only heir. Heir, H-E-I-R, not heir, A-I-R. It differs, okay? Because when the Marquis would die, who's the new Marquis? He's going to be Charles Darnley. He's the last member, Charles Darnley, of the Evremond family. Or Darnley he made it clear to his uncle that he was against the cruel system of his country. Even he said, a famous quotation, he said that we have done wrong and we are reaping the fruits of wrong. When he said we, his uncle said we, like it's you and me. He said no, I'm talking about you and my father. Darnley said that during his father's time, if anyone comes between the interest of his uncle and his father, simply they get rid of him by sending him to prison, which is the Bastille, or simply killing him. So they looked only for their own interest, okay? Darnley also said that he couldn't live on the expenses of the poor class, like collecting taxes from the poor class, taxes, never. He said that he would like to be an honorable man, a man who earned his own living, so he had to work. Darnley also mentioned that his family name, the Evremond family, was the most hated name all over France. He said that he was so ashamed of his family. He also denounced, like gave up his title, the property, the land, the chateau of his uncle. He wasn't in need of all of this at all. Darnley also said that he wanted to implement, like to carry out his mother's last pledge like request. He said that before his mother died, she asked him for a kind of a request. We call it will. She asked him to be merciful, to be unlike his uncle and his father, to try to make up for the wrongs that had been done by his uncle and his father towards the poor class. The Marquis, he saw that they were just like having two different opinions and they will never ever agree. So to stop that kind of a dialogue, he said, well, Darnley, I guess that you are so tired, let's talk tomorrow, complete our conversation tomorrow. tomorrow in the early morning, if you just take a look here, the Gabal, the servant, he went inside the Marquis bedroom, and to our amazement, here it is, the Marquis was dead. Who killed him? Of course, he was Gaspard. How did Gaspard kill him? He drove a knife into his heart, and the Marquis died at once. If we imagine that's the knife, okay, around the handle of the knife, he left a small piece of paper, Gaspard, in which he wrote, "Drive him fast to his tomb, this from a jack." Like, take and bury him, okay? Let's get rid of his evil. Okay, so the result, that simply, who should be the new Marquis? Charles Darnley. Charles Darnley, he left the dead body of his uncle, the properties, the land, the chateau, all, and he went back to England, never to step back inside France. That was his own intention. And he left Gabal, the servant, to be in charge of the chateau and the lands. And he asked Gabal never to collect any taxes from the poor class. I guess we come to the end of chapter 6. Here it is, if you can just see it. And thank you all, my dear students, and wish you best of luck.